The crystal champagne flute felt cold and heavy in Eleanor's hand. From her corner of the grand ballroom, the party was a kaleidoscope of sound and light. Laughter mixed with the low hum of conversation and the distant, mournful notes of a cello. Men in sharp, dark suits moved like sharks through the glittering crowd, their wives drifting beside them like colorful, exotic fish. 2 years. They were celebrating 2 years of her marriage to Julian Croft. 2 years of living in this house, the Vance estate, which had been her childhood home and now felt like a beautiful cavernous museum dedicated to a life she was not living. She watched Julian across the room. He was the center of a tight circle of men, his posture radiating an easy confidence that drew people in. He gestured with his glass, his smile brilliant under the chandeliers, and the other men laughed on cue. He looked like a king holding court. He had always looked the part. That was his gift. He could wear power as effortlessly as he wore his tailored suits. From this distance, he was perfect. A handsome, ambitious husband for the daughter of the formidable Marcus Vance. Everyone said it was a perfect match, a union of legacy and ambition. Ellie took a small sip of champagne. The bubbles fizzed on her tongue, a brief, bright sensation in the dull ache of the evening. She felt like a ghost at her own celebration. She was dressed in a simple, elegant emerald gown that Julian had picked out. Her long auburn hair was styled in a way he preferred. She was an ornament, placed carefully in the corner to complement the decor. Her father, Marcus, had been a man of few words and even fewer displays of affection, but he had a presence that filled every room. In his world, silence meant control, but with Julian, her silence felt like erasure. She was becoming transparent, a piece of glass people looked through to see him more clearly. Her gaze drifted past Julian to a portrait on the far wall. It was of her father, painted 5 years ago. He sat in a heavy leather chair, his face stern, his gray eyes seeming to follow her even now. He looked powerful, unmovable, a man carved from granite and secrets. He had never approved of Julian, not really. He had tolerated him. Marcus Vance did not approve of many people. He saw the world as a series of calculated risks, and Julian, with his predatory charm and insatiable ambition, was the biggest risk of all. Ellie had believed it was love. She had wanted so desperately to believe she was more than a bargaining chip in her own life. A voice startled her out of her thoughts. It was Thomas, an old friend of her father's, a man with kind eyes and a face creased with genuine smiles. He had known her since she was a child. "Eleanor, my dear, you look lovely, but you're hiding over here." She managed a small, grateful smile. "Thomas, it's good to see you. I was just taking a breath. It's a bit overwhelming." "I can imagine," he said, his voice warm. "Your father would have hated all this noise. He preferred his parties small and his conversations meaningful." Ellie felt a pang of nostalgia. He did. He always said a crowd was just a place to hide your enemies. Thomas chuckled, a soft, wheezing sound. He was right about that. "And how are you, really? This new life seems different for you." For a moment, Ellie was tempted to tell him, to let the carefully constructed facade crack and confess the deep, gnawing loneliness that defined her days. To tell him she felt like a stranger in her own skin. But she saw Julian's eyes flicker toward her from across the room. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. The warning was clear. "I'm very well, Thomas. Julian takes wonderful care of me," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Good, that's good to hear," he said, though his kind eyes held a trace of doubt. He squeezed her arm gently. "You know where to find me if you ever need anything. Anything at all." He moved on, swallowed back into the crowd, and the brief warmth of his presence vanished. Ellie felt a chill, even in the stuffy, overheated room. Julian was now excusing himself from his circle. He was walking toward her. His stride was purposeful, a predator closing in on its prey. The smile he had worn for his audience was gone, replaced by a tight, unreadable mask. He reached her side, his hand landing on the small of her back. His fingers pressed into her spine, a gesture that looked possessive to the outside world but felt like a vice to her. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked, his voice a low murmur against her ear. It was smooth as silk and just as cold. "It's a lovely party, Julian." "You were talking to Thomas," he stated. It was not a question. He's an old friend of my father's. He was just saying hello. He's a sentimental old fool who lives in the past, Julian said, his thumb rubbing small, insistent circles on her back. He has no influence, no value. Talking to him makes you look naive. His words were like small, sharp stones. She didn't respond. She had learned that arguing only made it worse. It was better to be silent, to be still, to wait for the moment to pass. But Julian wasn't finished. "Come with me," he said, his grip tightening. He began to steer her away from the wall through the parting sea of guests. People smiled and nodded as they passed. A perfect couple. Mr. and Mrs. Croft celebrating 2 years of blissful union. No one saw the tension in her shoulders or the hard set of his jaw. No one saw the way his fingers dug into her flesh. He led her out of the ballroom, the noise of the party fading behind them as he pulled her down a long, dim hallway. The air grew cooler, smelling of old paper, leather, and lemon polish. He was taking her to the library. Her father's library. It had been her sanctuary as a child, a place of quiet escape. Since Julian had moved in, it had become his unofficial office, a war room. Now it felt like an interrogation chamber. He pushed the heavy oak door open and guided her inside, shutting it firmly behind them. The click of the latch was deafening in the sudden, oppressive silence. The only light came from a single green-shaded lamp on the massive mahogany desk. It cast long, dancing shadows across the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Thousands of books, witnesses to this quiet humiliation. Julian released her and she instinctively wrapped her arms around herself. He walked to the desk, not looking at her, and placed his empty glass down with a precise, deliberate clink. He loosened his tie, a gesture of performative frustration. "What exactly did you think you were doing?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "Doing? I was just talking to him, Julian. It was nothing." "It was not nothing, Eleanor," he said, turning to face her. His blue eyes were like chips of ice in the dim light. "Everything in this room, in this house, in our lives is about perception. It is about strength. You were standing in a corner, looking lost. Then you engaged in a nostalgic, pointless conversation with a relic from a bygone era. It makes us look weak. It makes you look like a frightened child pining for her father." The accusation stung, mostly because it was true. She did miss her father. She missed his quiet, solid presence, his gruff protection that she had only begun to understand after he was gone. But she would not give Julian the satisfaction of knowing that. "He was being kind," she whispered, her voice feeling small and thin in the cavernous room. "Kindness is a currency for the poor, Ellie," Julian scoffed, taking a step toward her. "We don't deal in kindness. We deal in power, in leverage, in fear. Your father understood that. It's the one thing I've always admired about him. He knew that sentiment was a liability." He was standing in front of her now, looking down at her. She had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. She felt herself shrinking under his cold assessment. "My job," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "is to manage this empire, to drag it into the modern age, to deal with men who would gut us for a profit, to hold it all together. It is a complex, difficult, and all-consuming task." He paused, letting the weight of his self-proclaimed burden fill the space between them. "And what is your job, Eleanor?" he asked, the question hanging in the air, thick with contempt. She said nothing. Her throat felt tight, her heart pounding a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knew this was a test, and there was no right answer. He smiled, a cold, cruel twist of his lips. "Your job is simple. Your job is to be beautiful, to be graceful, to be a silent, perfect accessory on my arm. You are the daughter of Marcus Vance. Your name still opens certain doors. Your presence legitimizes my position. That is your function." He reached out and tucked a stray strand of her hair behind her ear. His touch was not tender. It was the gesture of a man adjusting a painting on a wall. "I need you to perform that function flawlessly. No saged and longing looks. No pointless chats with has-beens. Just stand there, smile, and look exquisite. That is all I require of you." Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and sharp. She fought them back. Crying was a weakness he despised. It would only prove his point. She stared at the knot of his tie, unable to meet his gaze. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. She could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. Finally, he sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. He took a step back, dismissing her. "Just try to remember your purpose," he said, his voice laced with pity. He turned away from her and adjusted his cuffs. "It's really not that complicated." He paused at the door, his hand on the brass knob. He looked back at her over his shoulder, his expression one of finality, as if delivering a concluding argument. "You are the perfect camouflage after all. No one looks past a beautiful tragedy to see the man standing behind it. Now pull yourself together. I'll be back for you in 10 minutes." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut, but he didn't latch it this time. It was left slightly ajar, a final casual insult. She was not even worth securing the room for. The sounds of the party, the music and the laughter filtered faintly into the library. They sounded like they were coming from another world, a planet she could no longer reach. Camouflage. The word echoed in the crushing silence of the room. It landed in the hollow space in her chest, a single, perfectly aimed bullet that shattered everything. All her hopes, her denials, the fragile story she had told herself about their marriage. It was all a lie. She was not a partner. She was not a wife. She was not even a person to him. She was a tool, a prop, a disguise. Her fingers, still wrapped around her body, tightened until her nails dug into her arms. She didn't feel the pain. All she felt was the devastating, ice-cold clarity of his words. "You're just camouflage." She stared at the closed door, at the thin sliver of light from the hallway. Julian was out there, smiling, charming, weaving his web, and she was in here, in the dark, with the ghost of her father and the truth of what she had become. She stood frozen in the silent library, utterly and completely alone. The echo of his voice was the only company she had left, repeating the one word that had just defined her entire existence. Camouflage. The party went on without her. The world went on without her. She was just a shadow in the background, perfectly placed and perfectly still. Time ceased to have meaning in the library. Eleanor stood motionless, a statue carved from shock, long after Julian's footsteps had faded. The heavy scent of old leather and his lingering cologne choked the air. Camouflage. The word was a physical thing, a shard of glass lodged in her throat. It wasn't just an insult, it was a definition. Her entire existence, her marriage, her place in this house, all of it was a lie designed to conceal the man who had just walked away. He had not just wounded her, he had erased her. Eventually her limbs remembered how to move. She drifted from the library, a ghost in her own home. The grand hallway, once buzzing with the life of the party, was now a cavern of shadows and silence. Empty glasses stood on polished tables like tiny, forgotten monuments. A single white rose, fallen from a vase, lay bruised on the marble floor. She saw herself in its petals, once perfect and now trampled. The party was over. The performance was done. She climbed the sweeping staircase, her hand trailing along the cold, smooth wood of the banister. Each step was a deliberate effort against a current of despair pulling her down. Her bedroom, their bedroom, felt alien. The vast, ornate space was designed for a power couple, a united front. But she was not part of a couple. She was a prop. Julian was not there. His side of the king-size bed was pristine, the pillows untouched. He often worked late into the night, but tonight his absence felt like a continuation of his earlier dismissal. He had left her in the library, and he was still leaving her now. She changed out of her silk dress, the fabric feeling like a costume she could no longer bear to wear. She slipped into a simple cotton nightgown, the soft material a small, pathetic comfort against her skin. Sleep was an impossible dream. Her mind was a frantic storm of echoes. Julian's voice, smooth and cutting. Camouflage. Just camouflage. The words spun and sharpened, each rotation carving deeper. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling the emptiness of the bed, the room, her life. It was a cold, vast, and suffocating space. After what felt like hours, a desperate thirst drove her from the bed. It was more than a physical need for water. It was a need to escape the four walls that were closing in on her. She had to move, or she felt she might shatter. She opened the bedroom door with infinite care, the latch clicking softly in the profound silence. The house at night was a different beast. During the day, it was a stage for the Vance family's power. At night, it was a museum of secrets, its long corridors dark and watchful. Barefoot, she padded across the cool, polished floors of the upper landing. Moonlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, painting stripes of silver and black across the hallway. Every familiar portrait on the wall seemed to watch her with accusing eyes. Ancestors she barely knew, their faces stern and unyielding. Her father's portrait hung at the end of the hall, larger than the rest. Even in oil paint, his presence was formidable, his gaze seeming to cut right through the darkness. She always felt he was disappointed in her, that she was too soft, too unlike him. Tonight, she felt she had failed him in a way she couldn't yet name. As she reached the top of the stairs, a faint sliver of light from below caught her eye. It came from her father's study, or rather what was now Julian's study. He had claimed it almost immediately after the wedding, a symbolic transfer of power that everyone had noticed and no one had commented on. A low murmur accompanied the light. A voice, Julian's voice. He was supposed to be working in his Manhattan office. Her heart gave a painful thud. Why was he here in this room at this hour? A cold dread, sharp and instinctive, washed over her. It was different from the hollow pain she'd felt earlier. This was an active fear, a primal warning bell ringing in the deepest part of her mind. She hesitated, her hand gripping the top of the newel post. She should go back to bed. She should pretend she hadn't seen or heard anything. That was what the good, quiet camouflage would do. But the girl who had stood frozen in the library was gone. In her place was a woman with a splinter of ice in her heart, and she needed to know. She descended the stairs one by one, staying in the deep shadows along the wall. The marble was shockingly cold against the soles of her feet. Each step was a universe of risk. A creaking floorboard, a misjudged shadow, could betray her. The house was so quiet she could hear the frantic beat of her own blood in her ears. As she drew closer to the study, Julian's voice became clearer. It was the voice he used when he was sure no one of consequence was listening. It was stripped of charm, leaving only the raw, grating sound of his ambition. The heavy oak door was open just a crack, enough for the light to spill out, enough for his words to travel. Eleanor pressed herself flat against the wall beside the doorframe, her body rigid. She held her breath, tilting her head just enough to listen. He was on the phone. "No, you listen to me," Julian's voice snapped, hard and impatient. "The deal is holding, but it's fragile. We need to be ready to move the second the landscape changes." There was a pause. She imagined someone on the other end, one of his lieutenants, a man with a hungry face she'd seen at the party. "I don't care about his methods," Julian continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. "Marcus built this thing with fear and loyalty. Old world nonsense. Loyalty is a currency for fools. Fear is useful, but it has to be my fear, not the ghost of his." He laughed, a short, ugly sound with no humor in it. It was the sound of a predator tasting blood on the air. Eleanor's fingers curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. The ghost of him. He was talking about her father. Her living, breathing father, who was at this very moment asleep in his own wing of the house. "Look, the doctors give him 6 months, maybe a year," Julian said, his tone dismissive, as if discussing a boring business forecast. "The old man's heart is a ticking clock. And I'll tell you something, Thomas, when he finally kicks it, we're not just taking over. We're gutting this organization from the inside out." A gasp caught in Eleanor's throat. She pressed her hand hard against her mouth, the pressure of her own fingers a painful reality check. It couldn't be real. This was a nightmare. He couldn't be talking about her father that way. The man whose empire he had married into, the man who had given him everything. Every one of his loyalists, every captain who still thinks Marcus Vance walks on water, they're the first to go, Julian went on, his voice filled with a chilling excitement. "We'll cut them out like a cancer. We'll restructure the finances, move everything into accounts they can't touch, that no one can trace back to the old books. I'll rebuild this entire empire in my own image. Brighter, faster, cleaner, no more sentimental baggage." Sentimental baggage. Was that her father? Or was it her? The thought sent a new wave of cold through her body. The word camouflage came back, but now it had a new and terrifying context. It wasn't just about her social role. She was the cover for his patient, methodical conquest. She was the key that had let the viper into the garden, and he was just waiting for the gardener to die so he could poison all the roots. She could hear the faint, tinny squawk of the person on the other end of the line. Then Julian laughed again, louder this time. Ellie? Oh, don't worry about her. She won't be a problem. She believes the fairy tale. She'll be so busy mourning her dear old dad, she won't even notice us changing the locks on her gilded cage. She's perfect. She sees nothing. The cruelty of it stole her breath. He saw nothing. He was right. She had seen nothing. She had floated through her life, through her marriage, believing in a fantasy of love and partnership while he was sharpening his knives right beside her. The humiliation she felt in the library was a shallow cut compared to this. This was a disembowelment of her entire reality. The man she slept beside, the man she had promised her life to, was actively waiting for her father to die. He wasn't just planning to take over. He was planning to erase every trace of Marcus Vance, to desecrate his legacy out of pure, venomous pride. A floorboard creaked somewhere upstairs. Eleanor froze, her blood turning to ice. Julian's voice stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. She could hear her own heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that felt loud enough to fill the entire mansion. Had he heard it? Did he know she was there? She flattened herself further against the wall, trying to disappear into the plaster, praying for the darkness to swallow her whole. Seconds stretched into an eternity. She imagined the study door swinging open. She pictured Julian's face, his cold blue eyes widening first in surprise, then hardening into something lethal. The man who spoke of gutting her father's life's work would not hesitate to deal with her. The thought sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror through her. She was not just an inconvenience. She was a witness. Then she heard his voice again, lower now, more irritated. Hold on, I thought I heard something. Another agonizing pause. She squeezed her eyes shut. Don't come out. Please don't come out. The silence stretched, thin and taut. Finally, she heard him sigh. Nothing. Probably just the house settling. Where were we? Relief washed over her so intensely her knees felt weak. She didn't wait to hear more. She couldn't. Every additional word was another layer of poison seeping into her soul. She had to get away. Slowly, carefully, she began to move, pulling back from the doorframe like a swimmer receding from a shark. She didn't dare turn her back. She retreated backward, step by silent step, her eyes locked on the sliver of light, expecting it to widen at any moment. Her journey back up the stairs was a masterclass in terror-fueled stealth. She tested each step before putting her full weight on it, her muscles screaming with tension. The moonlight that had seemed beautiful before now felt like a spotlight, the shadows too shallow to hide in. The portraits of her ancestors seemed to mock her now, their painted eyes following her flight. You let him in, they seemed to say. You did this. When she finally reached the safety of her bedroom, she closed the door without making a sound, leaning her full weight against it as if to barricade herself in. Her body trembled uncontrollably, a violent tremor that started in her core and radiated out to her fingertips. She slid down the door until she was sitting on the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees, trying to hold herself together. The room was no longer a cold, empty space. It was enemy territory. The bed was not hers. The furniture was not hers. The life she thought she was living was not hers. It was a stage, and the director had just revealed the final bloody act of his play. The pain from Julian's earlier words was gone, burned away by the white-hot terror of what she had just learned. The emotional wound had been cauterized, leaving behind something harder and colder. She wasn't just a scorned wife. She was the daughter of a man who was being hunted by his own son-in-law. She was a pawn in a game so ruthless, she hadn't even known it was being played. Julian's words echoed, no longer just a painful memory, but a strategic assessment. She sees nothing. He was wrong. Now she saw everything. She saw him for exactly what he was. A patient predator, a smiling usurper, a man who would dance on her father's grave to build his own throne. Her heart was still pounding, a frantic, wild rhythm against her ribs. But beneath the fear, Something new was taking root, a chilling, terrifying clarity. The world, which had been a soft, focused blur of social obligations and emotional longing, had snapped into sharp, brutal focus. The camouflage was gone, ripped away, and for the first time, Eleanor saw the battlefield clearly. Sleep did not come. Ellie lay awake for hours, the words from the library echoing in the vast, silent bedroom. Camouflage. A pretty thing to hide behind. The chilling clarity from Julian's phone call had settled deep in her bones, a cold dread that felt more real than the silk sheets against her skin. She had drifted into a shallow, restless state just before dawn, a landscape of fractured dreams where she was running down endless, dark corridors. The morning broke not with sunlight, but with the sharp, insistent ringing of the telephone on Julian's nightstand. The sound was a violation slicing through the fragile quiet of the house. Ellie flinched, her eyes snapping open. Julian stirred beside her, reaching for the phone with the fluid motion of a man accustomed to being needed at any hour. He sat up, the sheet pooling around his waist. "Croft," he answered, his voice rough with sleep but already sharp. Ellie watched his profile, the hard line of his jaw against the pale morning light filtering through the curtains. She held her breath, her own fear from the night before rushing back, fresh and terrifying. There was a pause as the person on the other end spoke. Julian's posture didn't change. He showed no surprise, no alarm. He just listened. "When?" he asked. Another pause. "I see. Is it confirmed?" A final, shorter pause. "Understood." He ended the call and placed the phone back in its cradle with a soft, deliberate click. The sound was deafening in the silence. He didn't turn to her immediately. He stared at the wall for a long moment, his expression unreadable, a mask of cold calculation. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew with a primal instinct that something fundamental in her world had just broken. Finally, he turned his head, his blue eyes finding hers in the dim light. There was no softness in them, no shared humanity. He looked at her as if she were a line item on a long and complicated list. "Your father had a heart attack during the night," he said, his tone as flat and factual as a news report. "He's dead, Ellie." The words didn't seem to make sense. They were just sounds, disconnected from meaning. Dead. Her father. The immovable mountain at the center of her life, the source of all its gravity and all its shadows. Gone. A strange buzzing filled her ears, and the room seemed to tilt slightly. She felt a wave of nausea. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask a question, to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat had closed up completely. All she could see was her father's face in her mind, his stern eyes, the rare, almost imperceptible softening when he thought she wasn't looking. Julian watched her reaction with a detached curiosity, like a scientist observing a specimen. He didn't move to comfort her. He didn't offer a hand or a kind word. Instead, he swung his legs out of bed and stood up, already in motion. "I have to make some calls," he announced, walking towards the dressing room. He was already shrugging on a robe, his mind clearly miles away, working through a new set of problems. Ellie remained frozen in the bed, the blankets suddenly feeling as heavy as lead. Grief was a cold, sharp thing, but this was something else. This was terror. The man she had heard plotting to gut her father's legacy was now free to do so. The only obstacle was gone. She heard the muffled sounds of Julian's voice from the other room, not the tone of a grieving son-in-law, but the crisp, commanding voice of a new chief. She finally managed to move, pushing herself into a sitting position. Her body felt alien, clumsy. The air in the room was thick, hard to breathe. The scent of wilting roses from a vase on her dresser was suddenly cloying, unbearable. She looked around the opulent bedroom, at the gilded furniture and heavy silk drapes. It had always felt like a beautiful cage. Now the bars felt colder, harder. Julian strode back into the room, already tying a silk tie around his neck. He had his phone pressed to his ear, his other hand gesturing impatiently as he spoke. "No, I don't care what the preliminary schedule was. Everything has moved up. Everything." He paused, listening. "Then you wake him, tell him the landscape has changed. I want a full asset report on my desk by noon." He was a whirlwind of purpose, a stark contrast to the profound stillness that had fallen over Ellie. She found her voice. A weak, trembling whisper. Julian? He glanced at her, irritation flickering in his eyes before he smoothed it over. He held up a finger, signaling for her to wait, then spoke back into the phone. Listen to me carefully. Lock down all pending transfers. Nothing moves without my direct authorization. Nothing. Am I clear? He didn't wait for an answer. He hung up and tossed the phone onto the bed. What is it, Ellie? He asked, his voice laced with a weary patience that was more insulting than outright anger. My father, she began, the words catching in her throat. We have to go. We have to see him. Julian finished adjusting his tie, his eyes on his own reflection in the mirror. There's nothing to see. The staff at his residence are handling the immediate arrangements. The professionals will take over from there. He turned to face her, his expression one of weary condescension. Ellie, I understand this is a shock for you, but you need to understand something. Your father's passing creates a massive power vacuum. If I don't fill it, right now, everything he built will be torn apart by wolves before his body is even cold. His words were like slaps. He spoke of her father's life work as a prize to be claimed, a territory to be secured. He spoke of wolves, but the only wolf in the room was him. So, he continued, walking to the door, while I handle the important business, your job is to handle the funeral. Talk to the planners, pick the flowers, the music, whatever it is you do. Make it dignified. Your father deserves that much. He paused at the door, his hand on the knob. Try to hold it together. A hysterical widow is not a good look for us right now. And with that, he was gone, leaving behind only the scent of his expensive cologne and a silence that was heavier and more menacing than before. Handle the funeral, the important business. The words echoed in her head, intertwining with the word from last night. Camouflage. Her role was still the same, to provide a respectable, beautiful front while he operated in the shadows. Even her grief was just a prop in his play, something to be managed for appearances. A tear finally escaped, sliding down her cheek, hot and sharp. It wasn't just a tear of sorrow for her father. It was a tear of rage, of utter, helpless humiliation. She spent the next few hours in a daze. The household staff moved through the halls like ghosts, their faces etched with genuine grief. Maria, the head housekeeper who had been with the family for 30 years, found Ellie sitting in the drawing room, staring at a portrait of her father above the mantelpiece. Maria's eyes were red and swollen. She placed a cup of tea on the table beside Ellie, her hand trembling. I am so sorry, Miss Eleanor, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ellie couldn't respond. She could only nod, the gesture feeling hollow and meaningless. The shared sorrow of the staff felt more real than her own husband's cold ambition. She could hear Julian's voice, a constant, low murmur from behind the closed doors of the main study. Her father's study. He was in there, on the phone, cementing his new reign. Each clipped sentence she overheard was a nail being hammered into her father's coffin. He wasn't mourning. He was conquering. The funeral planner called, a woman with a practiced, somber voice. She asked about flowers, white lilies for dignity, or dark roses for sorrow. She asked about music. A string quartet? An organist? Ellie answered in monosyllables, the questions feeling absurd, surreal. She was planning the final farewell for a man whose empire was being stolen before he was even laid to rest. She felt a profound sense of disloyalty, as if by choosing the flowers, she was complicit in Julian's charade. She was helping him create the dignified spectacle he wanted. Late in the afternoon, a strange, morbid curiosity pulled her from the drawing room. She walked down the long, carpeted hallway, her footsteps silent. The house felt cavernous, each familiar object now imbued with a sense of loss. A bronze statue her father had loved, a landscape painting he had bought on a trip to Italy. They were just things now, artifacts in a museum of a life that was over. She stopped outside the study. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. For years, this room had been the forbidden heart of the Vance estate. When her father was alive, no one entered it without being summoned. It was his sanctuary, his war room. The air around it had always seemed to hum with his power. Now, the only sound was Julian's voice. It was different now. The urgency from the morning as Buenon. It was replaced by a relaxed, confident tone. the sound of a man who has won. Ellie pushed the door open a few more inches, peering through the gap. The sight that met her eyes stole the breath from her lungs. Julian was not at the desk. He was leaning back in her father's chair, the massive, throne-like leather chair that was synonymous with Marcus Vance. It was positioned to face the large window overlooking the gardens, but he had it swiveled slightly toward the door. He had a glass of what looked like whiskey in one hand, the afternoon light catching the amber liquid. He was smiling, not a big smile, but a small, satisfied smirk as he listened to the person on the phone. "Don't worry about them," Julian said, his voice smooth as silk. "The old guard is sentimental. They'll fall in line once they realize where the money flows from." He took a slow sip of his drink. "Yes, it's a new era. Cleaner, more efficient." He chuckled, a low, predatory sound that made Ellie's blood run cold. "He built a kingdom, I'll give him that. But he ran it like a feudal lord. It's time for an emperor." An emperor. He saw himself as an emperor. Her father was not just a predecessor to be respected, but a relic to be surpassed. An old feudal lord whose kingdom was now ripe for the taking. He must have sensed her presence. His eyes flickered towards the doorway and met hers. For a split second, she expected to see guilt, or perhaps anger at being spied on. She saw neither. His smile didn't falter. It widened just slightly. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. A look that said, "See, I told you this would happen. This is mine now, and you can't do a single thing about it." He didn't even bother to hide it. He was flaunting his victory, enjoying her shock, her pain. He slowly raised his glass to her in a mock toast, a silent acknowledgement of her presence, of her defeat. The gesture was more brutal than any insult. He was toasting his success, using her father's crystal, in her father's chair, in her father's house. And she was the silent, powerless witness to it all. Ellie pulled back from the door, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. She backed away down the hall, her heart a block of ice in her chest. The grief for her father was still there, a deep, aching wound. But it was now overshadowed by a chilling, absolute certainty. The warmth of the house was gone. The memories it held were tainted. Julian had not just taken over a business. He had conquered her home. He had conquered her life. She retreated to her room, the one place that still felt remotely hers, and locked the door. She stood in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, trembling not from cold, but from a terrifying realization. Julian's words from the night before came back to her, no longer just a cruel insult, but a statement of fact. She was camouflage, an ornament, a pretty, grieving widow who would arrange the flowers while he seized the throne. She looked at her reflection in the large, ornate mirror. The face staring back was pale, her green eyes wide with a horror that was just beginning to crystallize into something else, something harder. She was trapped. Every exit was guarded, not by men with guns, but by Julian's complete control over her life, her finances, her world. She watched Julian take her father's seat in the study, a grim look of triumph on his face, and knew she was now a prisoner in her own home. The day of the will reading felt like a second funeral. The first had been for her father's body. This one was for his legacy. Ellie sat on a stiff leather chair in the vast library, the same room where Julian had branded her with the word camouflage. Today, the room was full. A dozen of her father's most trusted men, their faces like stone masks, lined the walls. They were vultures in bespoke suits, waiting to see which way the carcass would fall. Julian sat beside her, a study in feigned solemnity. He placed a hand on her knee, a proprietary gesture for the audience. The touch felt like ice. Arthur Finch, the family's lawyer for half a century, sat behind her father's enormous oak desk. He looked ancient, his skin as thin and dry as the documents spread before him. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. The air was heavy with the smell of wood polish and the faint, sweet scent of dying lilies from the funeral arrangements. Ellie focused on a small water ring on the polished table beside her, a pale ghost of a forgotten glass. She stared at it as if it held the secrets of the universe, anything to avoid looking at the expectant faces around her. She didn't belong here. She was just part of the scenery, the grieving daughter, the final piece of set dressing for Julian's coronation. Arthur began to read in a monotone voice, his words weaving a dry legal tapestry that would redefine their world. There were minor bequests to loyal staff, charitable donations that sounded hollow and performative. Ellie felt her own breath catch in her throat with each pause. She knew what was coming. She had known since the night she heard Julian on the phone laughing about gutting her father's life's work. This reading was not for her. It was the formal abdication she had been forced to witness. Then Arthur reached the heart of the matter. His voice remained flat, betraying no emotion. Regarding the operational control of Vance Holdings and its associated enterprises, he read, his eyes fixed on the page. All voting shares, directorial authority, and executive power I bequeath to my son-in-law, Julian Croft. A collective, nearly silent exhalation went through the room. It was the sound of allegiance shifting. Ellie watched as one of the men, a heavy-set captain named Thomas, gave Julian a slow, deliberate nod. The crown had been passed. She risked a glance at her husband. Julian's expression was perfect, a mask of humble gravity. But she saw it. She saw the flicker in his cold blue eyes, a flash of pure, unadulterated triumph. He had won. He had taken everything. His hand squeezed her knee slightly, a silent reminder of his victory and her part in it. You see, his touch said, this is what you were for. Ellie felt a wave of nausea. The room seemed to tilt, the dark, leather-bound books on the shelves blurring into a single brown smear. She wanted to scream. She wanted to stand up and tell them all who he was, what he planned to do. But her voice was gone, trapped in her throat by years of being told to be quiet. She was a statue of grief, and statues do not speak. Arthur Finch cleared his throat again, drawing her back. And to my beloved daughter, he continued, and for a single stupid heartbeat, a sliver of hope pierced through her despair. Perhaps her father had left her something, a piece of himself, a way out. To my only daughter, Eleanor Vance Croft, I bequeath the Vance family estate on Long Island, its grounds and all properties contained therein. There was a pause. The men waited. The house was a beautiful cage, but it was still a cage. It held no power. Furthermore, Arthur added, and the final nail was driven into her coffin. She is to be provided a personal living allowance of $100,000 per month to be administered by the new head of Vance Holdings. A personal allowance, the words hung in the air, thick and dripping with humiliation. She was not an heiress. She was a dependent, a child to be given pocket money by her husband, the man who despised her. A hot flush of shame crept up her neck, burning her cheeks. She could feel the men's eyes on her, a mixture of pity and dismissal. She was officially what Julian had always called her, an ornament, expensive to maintain, but ultimately powerless. She imagined her father signing this document, effectively agreeing with Julian. The thought was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She hated him for it, a sudden, sharp pang of betrayal that cut deeper than her grief. Julian leaned closer, his voice a low, condescending murmur, meant only for her. Don't you worry, darling. You'll be well taken care of. It was the voice one uses for a frightened pet. The meeting dissolved quickly after that. The men surrounded Julian, their voices low and respectful, pledging their fealty. They shook his hand. They clapped him on the shoulder. He was king, and they were his court. Ellie remained seated, frozen in her chair, the water ring on the table her only anchor. She felt invisible. Julian was holding court by the fireplace, his laughter echoing in the large room. He didn't look at her once. As people began to file out, Arthur Finch slowly gathered his papers. He moved with the careful deliberation of an old man. He walked past the circle of men around Julian, heading for the door. Then he stopped beside Ellie's chair, seemingly as an afterthought. My deepest condolences once again, Eleanor, he said, his public voice formal and distant. He bent slightly, as if his back ached. Under the cover of this gesture, his hand moved. She felt it before she saw it, the press of something thick and firm into her palm. Her fingers instinctively closed around it. It was a letter, a thick, heavy envelope sealed with dark wax. His fingers, cool and dry, brushed against hers. He leaned in closer, his mouth near her ear, his scent a mix of old paper and peppermint. From your father, he whispered. The words a ghost of a sound against the backdrop of Julian's confident pronouncements. Read it when you are alone. And then he was gone. He straightened up, gave a stiff nod, and walked out of the library without a backward glance. Ellie's hand tightened around the envelope. It felt warm now, or maybe it was just the blood returning to her numb fingers. The paper was heavy, expensive. The wax seal was unbroken. From her father. The words echoed in her mind, a strange counterpoint to the public humiliation she had just endured. She needed to leave. She stood up on shaky legs, the envelope hidden in the clutch of her hand. Julian glanced over, his attention finally snagged by her movement. Feeling unwell, Ellie? He asked, his tone laced with impatience. He wanted her gone so he could celebrate properly with his new subjects. Just a headache, she managed to say, her voice thin. I need to lie down. Of course, he said, waving a dismissive hand. Go rest. He turned back to his audience, and she ceased to exist for him once more. Ellie walked out of the library and into the grand, silent hall. Every step was a conscious effort. Her shoes made no sound on the thick Persian rugs. The house felt alien, a mausoleum that now belonged to her husband. She clutched the letter to her chest, her knuckles white. It was a secret. In a life where every move was watched and every word was judged, she had a secret. A final word from the father who had seemingly cast her aside. She climbed the sweeping staircase, her hand trailing along the cold, polished banister. Her reflection drifted past in the tall mirrors lining the hall, a pale, dark-clad ghost in a house of shadows. She reached the landing and walked down the long corridor to her bedroom. The door, which had always felt like the entrance to her cage, now felt like a gateway to a sanctuary. She slipped inside, closing it softly behind her. The sound of the heavy brass lock clicking into place was the most satisfying sound she had ever heard. It was a shield. For a moment, she just stood there, leaning her back against the solid wood, her eyes closed, simply breathing. The air in her room smelled of her, of lavender and books, not of power and betrayal. She opened her hand and looked down at the envelope. It was cream-colored with her name, Eleanor, written in her father's sharp, familiar script. Just her name. A single tear she hadn't realized she was holding back finally fell, splashing onto the paper. It wasn't a tear of grief or even of shame. It was something else entirely. Something she couldn't name. Holding the last thing her father had ever touched, the last words he would ever speak to her, she felt a strange and unfamiliar current run through her. It was not hope. It was not strength. It was just a flicker, a tiny, defiant spark in the vast, suffocating darkness of her despair. And for now, it was enough. The door was locked. The heavy oak felt like the final barrier between her and the rest of the world. Outside, in the grand halls of the Vance estate, Julian was carving up her father's legacy, his voice a low, confident murmur that carried even through the thick wood. But in here, there was only silence, a deep, suffocating quiet broken by the frantic beat of her own heart. Ellie sat on the edge of her bed, the heavy cream envelope resting in her lap. It felt impossibly heavy, as if it contained the weight of a life, her father's life, and perhaps her own. Her fingers, numb and cold, traced the sharp edges of the paper. The wax seal on the back was a deep burgundy, stamped with the Vance family crest, a stoic griffin. It was unbroken, perfect, a final intact piece of him in a world that had just been shattered. Arthur Finch's words echoed in her mind, a quiet instruction in the storm of the will reading. From your father, read it when you are alone. She was alone now, more alone than she had ever been in her entire life. For a long moment, she could not bring herself to open it. She was afraid of what it might say, more afraid of what it might not. Would it be a last, cold dismissal? A few formal lines of farewell, as distant in death as he had been in life? The thought was a familiar ache, a hollow space in her chest she had lived with for years. Taking a breath that did little to calm her, she slid her thumbnail under the seal. The wax cracked with a soft, brittle sound. It was the sound of something final. The folded pages within were of the same thick, expensive stock. She unfolded them slowly. The scent of old paper and the faint, almost imperceptible smell of her father's cigars filled the air. It was so distinctly him that a fresh wave of grief washed over her, sharp and sudden. And then she saw the handwriting. It was not the elegant script of a secretary. It was his. Bold, slightly slanted, the letters formed with impatient precision. He had written this himself. For her. Her eyes scanned the first line. Eleanor. Just her name. Seeing it written in his hand felt like a direct address, a voice from beyond the grave. She began to read, her world shrinking to the black ink on the page. If you are reading this, it means I am gone. It also means Julian is behaving exactly as I predicted he would. Ellie stopped. She read the sentence again. A cold shiver traced a path down her spine. He knew. He had seen it. All this time she had thought she was alone in her suspicions. Her unease dismissed his feminine anxiety. She had believed her father was blind to Julian's ambition, charmed by the same predatory grace that had once fooled her. But he had known. The thought did not bring comfort. Not yet. It brought a chilling question. If he knew, why had he done nothing? Why had he allowed this marriage? Why had he let Julian sink his hooks so deep into their lives, into the very heart of the family? She felt a surge of the old, familiar anger towards her father's cold pragmatism. She read on, her grip tightening on the pages. I owe you an explanation. More than one. You have spent your life believing I thought you were fragile, weak, a decoration to be kept safe and polished, but ultimately useless. I know you believe this because I allowed you to. I cultivated it. The words hit her like a physical blow. She had to lower the letter to her lap, her vision blurring. She stared unseeing at the damask pattern on the wall, her mind reeling. He allowed it? He cultivated it? The years of being spoken over in meetings, of being sent to handle floral arrangements while the men talked business, of being treated like a porcelain doll. It wasn't neglect, it was a strategy. The cruelty of it, the sheer cold-blooded calculation, made her stomach clench. He had deliberately made her feel small. Her gaze dropped back to the page, drawn by a terrible need to understand the reason for this long, painful deception. Our world, Eleanor, is a filthy one. It is a pit of snakes, and the biggest snakes wear the most expensive suits. I saw Julian for what he was the first day he walked into my office. All charm and no soul, an empty vessel hungry to be filled with my power. But he was also a mirror. He showed me what men like him see when they look at a woman like you. An opportunity, a key, a beautiful piece of camouflage to hide their advance. Camouflage. The word was there on the page, in her father's own hand. The same word Julian had thrown at her like a stone. Her breath hitched. A tear she hadn't realized was forming, spilled over and fell onto the page, smudging the ink of her father's signature at the bottom. He had heard, or he had simply understood Julian's nature so perfectly that he knew the exact shape his cruelty would take. I could have warned you, the letter continued. I could have forbidden the marriage. It would have been easy, but it would have taught you nothing, and I would have learned nothing about you. So I conducted an experiment, a terrible one, I admit, but a necessary one. I built you a gilded cage, and I let the fox into the garden to see if you would learn the nature of the beast on your own. Ellie's hands were trembling now. A terrible experiment. Her life, her marriage, her heartbreak. It was all a test. She felt a surge of rage so pure it almost choked her. How could he? How could he watch her suffer, watch her walk into a trap just for an experiment? It was monstrous. It was the coldest, most pragmatic thing he had ever done. But as the anger crested, it was followed by the pull of his next words, and the tide began to turn. I did not do it to test your weakness, Eleanor. I did it to test your strength. I raised you away from the filth. I gave you art and music and books. I filled your life with beauty to see if your character would take root. I wanted to know if a person could live in this gilded cage surrounded by temptation and cynicism and not become cynical themselves. I needed to know if your heart was true, because the power I was to leave behind is not a thing for a cynical heart. It would destroy such a person, and it would destroy everything I have built. She slowly sank back against the pillows, the letter held loosely in her hands. The anger was dissolving, replaced by a profound, earth-shattering understanding. He wasn't testing her for a weakness he suspected. He was searching for a strength he hoped was there. He hadn't seen her as fragile. He had been protecting her, preserving a part of her he considered more valuable than anything else. His distance wasn't a lack of love, it was quarantine. He was keeping her clean from the sickness of his world. The memory of 1,000 small moments flooded her mind, now cast in a completely new light. The way he would dismiss her from his study, not with contempt, but with an abruptness that now felt like a surgeon removing a healthy organ from a diseased room. The way he would insist she continue her art history studies, something Julian had always mocked as useless. It wasn't to keep her busy and out of the way, it was to nurture the very part of her that this world could not touch. All the years she had spent craving his approval, he had been silently giving it, not for what she did, but for what she was. With a deep, shuddering breath, she lifted the letter again. There was more. Julian made the classic mistake, the mistake all second-rate men make. He thinks the throne is the power. He thinks that by sitting in my chair, by taking over the operations, he has inherited the kingdom. He is a fool. A king with no gold is just a man in a fancy chair. The operations, the deals, the men who answer his calls, they are all fueled by one thing: money. The true power is not the throne. The real power is the treasury. Ellie's eyes widened. She leaned forward, her heart beginning to pound with a new, unfamiliar rhythm. It was not the fluttering of fear. It was the heavy, powerful beat of a drum. And it is all yours. The 4 words hung in the silent room. She read them again and again. It was impossible. The will reading had been clear. The operations went to Julian. She received the estate and an allowance, a pittance, a public humiliation. But her father's letter, this secret testament, said otherwise. It said everything. Everything was hers. How? How could that be possible? Arthur Finch had stood there and read the other will. Was this letter just a fantasy? A dying man's wish? But her father was not a man for fantasies. He was a strategist. Every move was deliberate. The public will, that was camouflage. Her humiliation was part of the plan. It was meant to make Julian underestimate her completely, to see her as a grieving, powerless widow, trapped in a house she now technically owned, but couldn't afford to run without his goodwill. It was the masterstroke of a ghost. Her eyes scanned the final paragraph, her breath held tight in her chest. He will not know it yet. It may be days or weeks, but soon he will find that the wells are dry. The accounts he thinks he controls are merely shells. The real fortune, the liquid assets that give the Vance name its weight, has been moved. It has been secured in a place only you can access. He has the keys to the car, but you have the engine. To find it, you do not need to look far. Think, Eleanor. What was the first gift I ever gave you that was only for you? The one I told you would always keep you safe. Look to the gift I gave you as a child. The letter ended there. Just his name, Marcus, signed with a firm, decisive stroke. Ellie let the pages fall from her fingers. They drifted onto the silk bedspread. Silent and profound, the air in the room felt different, charged with a new energy. Her father had not abandoned her. He had armed her. He had spent years forging a weapon that only she could wield, a weapon disguised as neglect, as weakness, as indifference. He had seen the end coming and had prepared for it, not by fighting his enemy, but by empowering his daughter. Tears began to stream down her face, but these were not the tears of a victim. They were not the hot tears of grief or the cold tears of despair. They were tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking release, tears of vindication. A lifetime of feeling invisible and unloved was being rewritten in a single moment. He had loved her. He had loved her so much that he had trusted her with everything. He trusted her to be strong, to be smart, and to have a heart pure enough to wield absolute power without being corrupted by it. He saw her. He had seen her all along. The gift, the first gift that was only for her. Her mind raced back through the years. Birthdays, holidays, a stream of expensive but impersonal dolls and dresses. But there was one that was different. She was small, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, sick with a fever. He had come into her room, a rare visit. He had sat on the edge of her bed, his large, imposing frame looking out of place amongst her childhood things. He hadn't said much. He never did. but he had pressed something cool and metallic into her palm, a simple silver chain. "This is Saint Christopher," he had said, his voice a low rumble. "He protects travelers, so you are always safe on your journey." It was a strange gift for a man who had no religion, but she had treasured it. She had never taken it off. Slowly, as if in a trance, Ellie's hand rose to her throat, her fingers, no longer cold but buzzing with a strange electric warmth, closed around the small, worn silver medallion that rested just below her collarbone. It was cool against her skin, familiar, a constant, silent presence for 2 decades. She had always thought of it as a simple piece of sentiment, a rare flicker of softness from a hard man. But it wasn't. It was a key. It was the engine. It was everything. Tears streamed down her face, but a new light was dawning in her eyes. The light of a terrible, beautiful, and inescapable purpose. The tears had dried on her cheeks, leaving behind the tight, salty feeling of old grief. Eleanor's hand remained at her throat, her fingers closed around the St. Christopher medallion. It was a familiar weight, a piece of her childhood she had never taken off. The metal was cool against her skin, a stark contrast to the fire her father's letter had lit in her chest. For years, this small silver disc had been a simple comfort, a relic of a love she thought was one-sided and conditional. Now it felt heavy with unspoken words, with the gravity of a life secret. She unclasped the thin chain, the practiced motion of her fingers automatic. The medallion fell into her palm, heavier than it had ever seemed before. She sat at her vanity, the polished wood reflecting the soft light of a single silk-shaded lamp. The room was a cage of quiet luxury, filled with things Julian had chosen. The heavy damask curtains, the silver-backed brushes on the dresser, the scent of expensive perfume in the air. All of it felt like a costume, a set for a play in which she was a silent character. Her father's letter lay beside her hand, the crisp paper softened by her desperate grip. "He thinks the throne is the power. The real power is the treasury, and it is all yours." The words pulsed in her mind, a new and terrifying heartbeat. "Look to the gift I gave you as a child." She held the medallion under the light. It was worn smooth in places from decades of touch. The image of the saint, staff in hand, was faint, the edges softened by time. She remembered the day her father gave it to her. She was 8 years old, sick with a fever that had kept her in bed for a week. He had come into her room, a rare visit. He smelled of cigars and the cold night air. Marcus Vance did not sit on the edge of her bed or smooth her hair. He stood by the door, an awkward, towering figure in her frilly, girlish room. He had simply held it out to her in his large, calloused palm. "For protection," he had grumbled, his voice rough. "Saints are for people who need help on their journey." She had thought he meant her journey through life, through the lonely halls of the estate. Now she understood. He had meant a very different kind of journey. Her thumb traced the milled edge of the medallion, a nervous habit. She had done this 1,000 times before. In lonely school dormitories, during tense family dinners, on her wedding day, as she waited for a man she was trying so hard to love. But this time was different. Her touch was not idle. It was searching. Her father was not a man of sentiment. He was a man of layers, of secrets, hidden in plain sight. Every move he made had a purpose. A simple gift for protection was not his style. A tool disguised as a gift was exactly his style. Her finger pressed into the worn face of the saint, then traced the circumference again. Slower this time. Once. Twice. On the third pass, the pad of her thumb snagged on something. It was almost imperceptible. A hairline fracture in the silver, so thin it looked like a scratch. It ran along the raised border of the medallion, perfectly aligned with the intricate pattern. It was not a flaw. It was too precise. Her heart began to beat faster, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She tried to pry at it with her fingernail, but the seam was too tight. Her hands trembled. She looked around the room, her eyes darting. She needed something fine, something sharp. On her dresser, next to a crystal tray of earrings, lay a small, elegant hat pin with a pearl on its end. She never wore hats. It was another prop, a piece of Julian's vision of her. The irony was bitter. She picked it up. With the tip of the pin, she carefully pressed into the tiny seam. For a moment, nothing happened. She felt a surge of foolishness. Of course, it was just a scratch. She was a grieving daughter seeing ghosts. seeing secret messages in old trinkets. She was letting hope make her delusional. But her father's words echoed again. The real power is the treasury. He would not have left her with a riddle that had no answer. She applied more pressure, angling the pin just so. There was a faint click, a sound so small it was almost lost in the silence of the great house. The top half of the medallion shifted, just a millimeter. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, carefully, she put the pin down and used her fingernails to work the two halves apart. It was a screw mechanism, intricate and beautifully made. With a final soft twist, the medallion came open in her palm. It fell into two perfect silver shells. She had always imagined that if it opened, it would hold a tiny faded picture of her mother, or perhaps a miniature portrait of her as a child. A secret, sentimental treasure. She was wrong. There was no picture. There was no space for one. The inside of both halves was completely filled, machined from solid silver, and engraved into the polished concave surface was a dense microscopic spiral of letters and numbers. It was not handwriting, it was a code, precise, mechanical, and utterly impersonal. The characters were impossibly small, a work of breathtaking craftsmanship. They spiraled from the outer edge toward the center, a dense web of information. She had to squint to even make out the individual shapes. She felt a wave of dizziness. This was it. This was the key her father had spoken of. Not a key to a safe or a lockbox. It was something far more complex. It was a language she could not speak, a map she could not read. She moved back to her desk, her legs unsteady. In one of the drawers, among embossed stationery and fountain pens, was a heavy brass magnifying glass her father had used for reviewing contracts. Its weight was reassuring in her shaking hand. She held the glass over one half of the open medallion. The tiny characters leaped into focus. GC7F R9T 4K1 L8B. The sequence continued, a long, unbroken chain of alphanumeric code. It looked like a password to a bank account, but it was impossibly long. It covered the entire inner surface of the medallion. She moved the glass to the other half. It was the same. More code, row after row of it. The air in the room grew thick. The silence pressed in on her. She felt as though she was at the bottom of the ocean, the weight of a vast, secret world resting just above her head. This was her father's love, she realized. It was not in hugs or bedtime stories. It was here in this cold, intricate, and powerful object. He had protected her, not by sheltering her, but by arming her. He had given her a weapon, disguised as a prayer. The sheer calculated genius of it was terrifying. Julian, with all his swagger and ambition, was fighting for control of the visible kingdom. The soldiers, the territories, the castle. Her father had quietly signed over the deed to the entire world on which that kingdom was built. A single tear escaped and traced the path of the earlier ones down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of profound, aching understanding. She finally saw her father not as the cold, distant patriarch, but as a master strategist who had been playing a long, lonely game against the world and against the very man he allowed into his family. He had seen Julian for what he was from the very beginning. He had seen the predator circling his only child. And instead of chasing him away, he had built a better cage, a more intricate trap. Julian thought he was the hunter. He had no idea he was the prey. Eleanor looked at her own reflection in the dark glass of the window. The pale, fragile woman staring back at her was a stranger. That was Julian's Ellie. That was the camouflage. A pretty, sad thing to be draped over the arm of a powerful man. A ghost in her own home. But her father had seen someone else. He had seen the person capable of wielding this. He had trusted her with the heart of his entire empire. He had not seen her as weak. He had seen her as disciplined. Her quiet obedience was not fragility, it was control. Her ability to endure Julian's casual cruelty was not passivity, it was patience. He had been testing her all along, testing her strength, her character, her ability to keep a secret. She closed the medallion, the two halves clicking shut with satisfying precision. She twisted it, and the seam vanished once more, becoming just a worn silver trinket. She slipped the chain back around her neck, the metal now warm from her skin. It felt different. It was no longer a memento, it was an arsenal. The weight was no longer just sentimental, it was the weight of responsibility, the weight of power. Julian was downstairs in her father's study, drinking her father's whiskey, sitting in her father's chair, believing he had won. He was making calls, moving pieces on a chessboard, unaware that the board itself now belonged to her. She looked at the complex code she had hastily scribbled onto a piece of paper. It stared back at her, a meaningless jumble of characters. A map to a future she never imagined. A future where she was not a prisoner, not a decoration, not camouflage. A future where she was free. But the map was written in a language she did not understand. She held the key to everything, but there was no door in sight. The hope that had soared in her chest just moments before was now tempered by a cold, practical fear. Her father had given her the weapon, but he had not told her how to fire it. She was alone in this gilded cage, holding the secret to its destruction, with no idea what the first step was. The numbers engraved on the silver felt cool and sharp against her fingertip. They were meaningless, a language from a world she had never been invited to join. For 2 days, Ellie stared at the code, the medallion sitting on her dressing table like a tiny, silent sphinx. It was a map her father had written, but a map without a legend is just a drawing. It was a key without a lock. Her future was a locked room, and she was standing in the hallway with no idea which door to even try. The thought circled back, again and again, to one person. The only person her father had trusted outside the family. Arthur Finch. Getting to him was the first test. Julian had her watched. She knew it instinctively. The drivers, the house staff, even the gardeners seemed to glance her way a little too often. They were his eyes now, so she played the part he had assigned her, the grieving, fragile widow's daughter. She requested a trip into the city to see a grief counselor, a name she pulled from a magazine. It was the kind of weak, predictable thing he would expect her to do. Julian had agreed with a wave of his hand, too busy in her father's study to care about her pathetic little errands. He didn't even look up from his phone. She had the driver drop her a block away from the therapist's office. The moment the black town car turned the corner, Ellie's fragile posture vanished. She walked quickly, her head down, melting into the anonymous lunchtime crowd of Manhattan. She didn't use her own phone. She found a payphone on a grimy street corner, the receiver sticky and cold. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she fed the coins into the slot. She dialed the number for Arthur's firm from memory. When a crisp receptionist answered, Ellie's voice was a low whisper. She didn't give her name. She simply said, "Tell Mr. Finch that St. Christopher needs a guide." There was a pause on the other end, then a quiet click. She hung up, her hand trembling, and walked away without looking back. An hour later, a text message arrived on her own phone. It was from an unknown number, just an address in the East Village and a time. 3 o'clock. The address was not an office. It was a bookshop, its green paint peeling and its windows filmed with years of city dust. The sign above the door read Argosy Antiquarian. A small, handwritten note taped to the glass said, "Closed for inventory." Ellie pushed the door. A small bell chimed, a lonely sound in the cavernous silence. The air inside was thick with the scent of aging paper, leather, and something like sweet decay. Towers of books rose toward the ceiling, creating narrow canyons of shadow. Light struggled through the dirty skylights, illuminating swirling dust motes like tiny captured stars. It felt like a tomb for stories. From the back of the shop, a figure emerged. Arthur Finch looked smaller here, away from the polished mahogany of his law office. His tweed jacket seemed to blend with the dusty bindings of the books around him. He moved slowly, his eyes scanning the street outside before he turned the lock on the door, silencing the world behind them. He did not smile. His face was a mask of tired concern. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a low rumble. This was a profound risk. "You were his lawyer," she replied, her voice barely audible. "You were his friend. Who else could I possibly go to?" Her own question hung in the air, heavy with the truth of her isolation. Arthur nodded slowly, accepting her point. He led her deeper into the maze of shelves, to a small clearing where 2 worn leather armchairs faced each other. He gestured for her to sit. "Your message was from a code we established more than 20 years ago," he said, his gaze sharp and direct. "For an emergency of the highest order. I prayed I would never hear it." Ellie's hands were clenched in her lap. She took a deep breath, the dusty air filling her lungs. My father left me a letter. He told me to look at a gift he gave me when I was a child. She reached into the collar of her dress and pulled out the thin silver chain. The two halves of the St. Christopher medallion lay in her palm, exposing the secret they held. She held it out to him. Arthur took a pair of reading glasses from his jacket pocket and perched them on his nose. He leaned forward, his old eyes scrutinizing the impossibly tiny script. He was silent for a long time, so long that Ellie could hear the frantic beat of her own pulse in her ears. A deep sigh escaped him, a sound of immense weariness and profound respect. Ah, Marcus, he whispered to himself, you magnificent, paranoid old fox. You actually did it. He looked up at Ellie, and for the first time she saw something beyond the lawyer. She saw the man who knew her father's deepest secrets. This, Eleanor, is not a code, it's a key, a master key to a kingdom your husband has no idea even exists. Ellie leaned forward. What kingdom? He took everything. He sits in my father's chair, he runs the company. The will gave him everything of importance. No, Arthur said, his voice firm. The will gave him the throne, the title, and the machine, a car without fuel. Your father spent the last 10 years building a parallel financial structure, one that exists entirely offshore, entirely liquid, and entirely outside the purview of Vance Holdings. Julian controls the operations. He can make deals, he can move product, he can command men, but he cannot pay for any of it, not for long. Ellie felt a wave of dizziness. I don't understand. The money, Arthur interrupted gently, is not in the corporate accounts Julian is so proudly seizing. The real money, the vast generational wealth of the Vance family, was systematically moved, siphoned off into a portfolio of anonymous accounts stretching from Geneva to Singapore. That portfolio is what this key unlocks. It gives you, and only you, total control over every last dollar. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the dusty air. We are not talking about millions, Eleanor. The number has 10 zeros, maybe more. 10 zeros, $1 billion. The number was an abstraction, a sound without meaning. Her mind simply could not grasp it. She felt a strange, hysterical laugh bubbling in her chest and swallowed it down. It was too much. But how? Why? Your father was not a sentimental man, but he was not blind, Arthur explained, his voice softening. He saw Julian for what he was from the very first day you brought him home. He saw the ambition, the hunger. He knew Julian didn't love you. He loved your name. Marcus couldn't disown Julian without revealing his own suspicions and starting a war within the organization. A war you would have been caught in the middle of. So he did something far more clever. He let Julian think he was winning. Ellie stared at the worn leather of the armchair, her thoughts reeling. All those years she had thought her father was cold, distant, disappointed in her. She believed he favored Julian, respecting his ruthlessness. But it was all a performance, a long, elaborate deception designed to protect her. The realization was a fresh wave of grief, sharper and more painful than the first. It was grief for the man she never truly knew. He built you a gilded cage, Eleanor, Arthur continued, as if reading her mind. To the world, and to Julian, it looked like he was sheltering a fragile daughter, unfit for the family business. In reality, he was hiding his greatest treasure in plain sight. He was testing you. He wanted to see if power would corrupt you if you had it. He wanted to see if you would remain good, even when you were treated as nothing more than an ornament. Tears pricked her eyes. He thought I was camouflage too, she whispered, the word tasting like poison. He thought you were the perfect camouflage, Arthur corrected her gently. The one thing Julian would never, ever see as a threat. And that is why you are now the most powerful person in this entire equation. He leaned back, the old leather groaning. But the money is only half of it. The second part of the key, that is far more dangerous. Ellie wiped a tear from her cheek with the back of her hand. What's the second part? Your father called it the ledger. It's not a physical book. It's a digital file encrypted to a degree that would make a government blush, stored on a server that technically doesn't exist. This same key grants you access. The ledger is a record of everything, every deal, every payment, Every promise and every threat your father ever made over 40 years. He leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It contains the private banking details of politicians, the medical records of judges, photographic evidence of betrayals between so-called allies. It is a detailed account of every skeleton in every closet in this city. It is the source code of power in this world. Blackmail is a crude word. Your father preferred leverage. That ledger gives you leverage over every single person Julian believes is his ally. They are loyal to the Vance empire because they fear it. That ledger is the reason why. Ellie felt the blood drain from her face. This was not about money anymore. This was about secrets that could destroy lives, topple careers, and end families. Her father hadn't just left her a fortune. He had left her a weapon of mass destruction. The silence in the bookshop was absolute. She could feel the weight of all those untold stories pressing in on her from the shelves. All those forgotten words, and her father had created a new book, one that could burn the whole world down. She looked at her own hands. They were trembling. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she asked, her voice shaking. I'm not him. I can't be him." "No one expects you to be," Arthur said, his expression full of a grandfatherly pity that made her ache. "Marcus did not leave you a command, Eleanor. He left you a choice. He spent his life building a fortress to keep you safe. Now he has given you the keys and pointed you to the emergency exit." He reached into his jacket and pulled out 2 items. The first was a simple black burner phone, still in its plastic packaging. The second was a wall, crisp slip of paper. He slid them across the small table between them. Ellie stared at them. They seemed so small, so insignificant, to hold the weight of a new life. "The phone is clean, untraceable," Arthur said. "Use it for what comes next. On that paper is a name and a number in Geneva. He is the only person besides me who knows about this structure. He will guide you through the process of accessing the accounts and the ledger. He will help you create a new identity, a new life, anywhere in the world you choose." Ellie looked from the phone to Arthur's tired, kind eyes. The magnitude of it all was crashing down on her. The money, the secrets, the betrayal, the escape. It was all real. It was all happening. Her father had not abandoned her. He had armed her. She slowly reached out and her fingers closed around the burner phone. It was cold and impersonal. She picked up the slip of paper, a name, a long string of numbers. The key to everything. The air in her lungs felt thin. For her entire life, others had made choices for her father, then her husband. Now, the biggest choice of all was hers alone. Arthur stood up, his joints creaking. He looked down at her, his face a mixture of sorrow and hope. "The choice is yours, Eleanor," he said, his voice soft but clear in the dusty silence. "You can run, or you can rule." The car door closed with a soft, final click. It was the sound of a world sealing itself shut. Ellie stood on the gravel driveway, the night air cool against her skin. The Vance estate loomed before her, its dark windows like hollow eyes in a skull. It was her home. It was her prison. And tonight it felt like a tomb she was re-entering by choice. In her coat pocket, her fingers brushed against 2 foreign objects. One was the hard, anonymous plastic of a burner phone. The other was a simple slip of paper, its crisp edges feeling sharper than a knife. A Swiss contact. A choice. Run or rule. She let herself in through a side door, the familiar scent of lemon polish and old books filling her lungs. Nothing had changed. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked its slow, heavy rhythm, measuring out a life she no longer recognized as her own. She heard the distant murmur of a television from the direction of the study. Julian was likely in there, sitting in her father's chair, basking in the illusion of his new kingdom. The thought sent a tremor through her, a mix of fear and a strange bitter acid rising in her throat. She crept up the grand staircase, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the thick runner. Each step was a conscious effort to keep her breathing even, to prevent the storm inside her from showing on her face. Her bedroom was a sanctuary of shadows and silence. She locked the door, the bolt sliding home with a heavy thud that echoed the frantic beating of her heart. She didn't turn on the lights. Moonlight spilled through the tall windows, casting long, distorted shapes across the floor. She sank onto the edge of her bed, the silk comforter cool beneath her trembling hands. The phone and the paper felt impossibly heavy in her pocket. Arthur's calm, steady voice played over and over in her mind. The true power is the treasury, and it is all yours. For the first hour, or maybe it was two, she was paralyzed by sheer terror. Her mind raced, picturing all the ways this could go wrong. Julian finding out. The men loyal to him, men with no conscience, discovering her betrayal. She was not a strategist. She was not a fighter. She was the fragile, ornamental wife. She was camouflage. What was she thinking, meeting a lawyer in secret, accepting a ghost phone like some character in a spy film? Her father had overestimated her. He had built a fortress and given the keys to a girl who had never held a sword. The sheer numbers Arthur had mentioned were incomprehensible. A fortune that could reshape cities, topple governments, all tied to a code hidden in a child's trinket. It was too much. The weight of it was crushing her. She could just run. She could take a fraction of the money, enough to disappear. Find a quiet town somewhere, change her name, and live a simple, anonymous life. The thought was a siren's call, promising peace and safety. A life where she never had to think about Julian or this dark, violent world ever again. She lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, the moonlight painting shifting patterns on the plaster. She let the idea of escape wash over her. A small cottage by the sea, waking up to the sound of gulls instead of the oppressive silence of the mansion. No more walking on eggshells. No more rehearsing her words to avoid his anger. No more feeling her own presence shrink whenever he entered a room. It was tempting. It was so blessedly tempting. But as she imagined this peaceful future, another image pushed its way in. It was Julian, years from now, more powerful than ever. He would be the king of the empire he had stolen, her father's name and legacy twisted to serve his own limitless ambition. He would have a new wife, another pretty, quiet thing to stand by his side. And Ellie would be a ghost, a forgotten prelude to his great success. He would have won. He would have taken everything and faced no consequences. He would have proven that his cruelty was strength, his betrayal a smart move. The thought soured the fantasy of escape. It wasn't just about her freedom. It was about justice. It was about her father. She sat up, her body rigid. She remembered his hands, large and calloused, when he first placed the St. Christopher medallion around her neck. She had been 8 years old, frightened of the dark. He had knelt down, his stern face softening for just a moment. "This will keep you safe," he had said, his voice a low rumble. "Saints watch over travelers. And you, Eleanor, have a long journey ahead." She hadn't understood then. She thought he meant life in general. But he knew even then that she would one day need a map to guide her out of the darkness he had built around them. This was not just a gift of money, it was a mission. It was his final silent instruction. He did not raise her to run. He had sheltered her to test her, to see if the steel in his own spine had been passed down to her. Her grief, which had been a constant, dull ache since his death, sharpened into something else. It became a lens, focusing her thoughts. The fear began to recede, replaced by a slow-burning fire in her chest. The memories started to come, not as painful wounds, but as pieces of evidence. Exhibit A, their first anniversary. He had gifted her a diamond necklace so heavy it felt like a collar. Later that night, she'd heard him on the phone with one of his associates. Yes, she loved it, he'd said, his voice dripping with condescension. You hang enough diamonds on anything, it starts to look valuable. Exhibit B, a dinner with business partners. She had offered a mild opinion on a current event, something she'd read in a magazine. Julian had placed a hand on her arm, his grip surprisingly tight, his thumb pressing into the bone. His smile was wit and charming for the table. My wife is a romantic, he announced. She concerns herself with poetry, not profits. The table had chuckled politely. She had felt her face burn, her voice stolen from her for the rest of the evening. She was an accessory he had forgotten to silence. And then, the memory that dwarfed all others, the one that had become the cornerstone of her new reality. The library, the scent of old paper and his expensive cologne. The way he had looked at her, not with anger but with a flat, clinical disinterest, as if examining a piece of furniture that was out of place. You're just camouflage after all. The words had shattered her. Now they were reforging her. Camouflage. Something used to hide the true nature of a weapon. He was right, but he had misunderstood the weapon's identity. He thought he was the hunter. He never imagined he was hiding his target in plain sight. Her breath hitched, but it was not a sob. It was a gasp of cold, furious clarity. Run? No, running was what he expected her to do. He saw her as weak, emotional, and breakable. She would use that. She would let him keep seeing the fragile Ellie, the grieving widow, the useless ornament. While behind that mask, she would become everything he feared. She would become a strategist. She would become a ghost in his machine, pulling the levers, cutting the wires, until the whole monstrous engine ground to a halt. She rose from the bed and walked to the window, looking out over the dark manicured lawns, the grounds of her cage. He thought he had inherited an empire. He was wrong. Her father was a master of details. He had left Julian the throne, the title, the operational headaches. He had left him the structure, the building itself. But he had given her the foundation. He had given her the treasury, the accounts, the blackmail material. He had given her the ledger that recorded every secret, every debt, every sin the Vance organization had ever committed. An empire cannot run on reputation alone. It runs on cash. It runs on liquidity. It runs on the fear and loyalty bought with that cash. And she now controlled all of it. A plan began to form in her mind. It was no longer a vague notion of revenge. It was a sequence, a series of steps, precise and methodical. It was not a chaotic smash and grab. It would be a quiet, systematic demolition. She would not just take the money. She would unravel his deals one by one. She would drain the accounts at the exact moments they were needed most. She would pull the financial rug out from under him so completely that by the time he hit the ground, he would have nothing left but the shock of the fall. He wanted to gut the organization and rebuild it in his own image. She would leave him with a carcass he couldn't even give away. She would leave him powerless, indebted, and exposed. She would leave him with nothing. The one thing a man like Julian could never survive. The night was no longer an enemy. It was her ally. The silence of the house was her shield. She retrieved the burner phone and the slip of paper from her pocket. They no longer felt heavy. They felt like tools, simple, elegant, and lethally effective. She sat in a chair by the window, the phone in her lap, and watched the black sky slowly soften to a bruised purple, then to a soft, pearlescent gray. She did not sleep. She did not need to. Her exhaustion had been burned away by the sheer intensity of her purpose. She was no longer just grieving her father. She was becoming his legacy. A silent protector of what he truly valued, and a ruthless executor of his final judgment. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the horizon, casting a golden light into her room, Ellie finally moved. She walked to her vanity, a large, ornate piece with a triptych mirror. For years, she had sat here and applied a mask, a face of serene, pleasant beauty for her husband, for his world, the face of the perfect, decorative wife. Now she looked at her reflection, really looked. Her green eyes were clear, the puffiness from days of crying gone. They held a new light, a hard, brilliant glint that was not there before. There were no tears left. Her face was pale, but her expression was not one of sadness or fear. It was calm. It was resolute. It was the face of a woman who had spent the night walking through the fire of her own life and had not been burned, but forged. She picked up a silver hairbrush, her movements slow and deliberate. She was no longer Eleanor Croft, the tragic widow. She was not even just Ellie Vance, the forgotten daughter. She was something new, something she had not yet named. The woman in the mirror met her gaze, and they were in complete agreement. The choice had been made. The path was clear. The plan is set. The laptop felt cold and foreign in her hands. It was impossibly thin, with no logos, no branding, just a smooth, matte black surface that absorbed the light from her bedroom window. Arthur had delivered it himself, tucked inside a box of old law books, his eyes conveying a gravity that his simple words did not. Now it sat on her lap, a gateway to a world she was never meant to see. Outside her door, the vast house was quiet. It was the unnatural quiet of a place holding its breath. Julian was downtown in her father's office, wearing her father's authority like a stolen coat. He believed he was the king. He had no idea the castle was built on sand, and that she now held the deed to the desert beneath it. She took out the burner phone. It was heavy and utilitarian, the opposite of the sleek smartphone Julian had bought her, the one he occasionally used to track her location. With trembling fingers, she dialed the Swiss number from the slip of paper Arthur had given her. It rang twice, a strange international tone that sounded like a signal from another planet. A man answered, his voice devoid of any warmth or curiosity. It was as sterile as the inside of a vault. Yes, Ellie's own voice was a whisper. I was given this number by Arthur Finch. He told me to call. She could hear her own heart, a frantic, muffled drum against her ribs. There was a short pause. "You are aware of Mr. Finch. Do you have the access key?" "The access key?" she repeated, her mind blank for a terrifying second. Then she remembered. The medallion, the numbers engraved inside the silver shell. She fumbled with the chain around her neck, her fingers clumsy. She opened it and read the tiny, dense string of characters aloud. Her voice was shaky, but she did not make a mistake. The silence on the other end of the line stretched on. For a moment, she thought he had hung up. She pictured Julian bursting through the door, his face a mask of fury, having been alerted to her betrayal. But then the voice returned, altered. There was a subtle shift, a trace of acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. "Thank you, Mademoiselle Vance. We have been expecting you. My name is Thomas, and I will be your sole point of contact. Please power on the laptop you were given." Relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. Mademoiselle Vance, not Mrs. Croft. He had used her father's name, her real name. She did as she was told, flipping open the lid of the laptop. The screen glowed to life, showing only a single blinking cursor on a black background. "Your father was a man of immense foresight, mademoiselle," Thomas said, his voice a calm presence in her ear. "He constructed a fortress. We are now standing outside the main gate. The key you just provided has unlocked it. Now we must establish your identity to enter." For the next hour, Thomas guided her through a labyrinth of security protocols. It was a dizzying dance of passwords, authentication codes sent to the burner phone, and personal questions. The answers were things her father had secretly logged years ago. The name of her first pony, Ember. The town where her mother was born. The title of the book she'd read to him on his last good day. Each correct answer felt like a conversation with her father's ghost, a final secret lesson. He had seen everything. He had known. Finally, Thomas spoke again. "Authentication complete. Welcome to the ledger." The black screen dissolved. It was replaced by a clean, simple interface, a list of digital folders organized by year. Decades of them. Clicking on one opened another list. Company names, personal names, project code names. It was not an account statement. It was a library of secrets. Her father hadn't just left her money. He had left her the source of his power, the detailed history of every transaction, every alliance, and every act of leverage that built the Vance empire. She felt a wave of profound vertigo. It was too much. The sheer weight of the information was crushing. These were not just numbers and files. They were Louis' careers and fortunes held in a delicate balance. She saw the names of powerful men she'd met at parties, men who had smiled at her with condescending warmth, while her father held their ruin in a file just like these. "It is overwhelming, I know," Thomas said, as if sensing her paralysis through the phone. "Your father did not believe in leaving things to chance. Mr. Croft controls the machine. But you, mademoiselle, you control the fuel. Every significant asset, every liquid fund, is routed through accounts that are now under your exclusive authority." Her focus sharpened. The fuel, that was the key. Julian was in the driver's seat of a very impressive car, but he had no idea the gas tank was about to be siphoned dry. The days that followed blurted into a strange double life. To the staff and to Julian, she was the grieving widow lost in her sorrow. She stayed in her room, the heavy curtains drawn. She had meals brought up on trays, most of which she barely touched. The performance was effortless. The grief was real, but it was now overlaid with a cold, clear purpose that felt like ice in her veins. Her sorrow for her father was a shield, and she used it without shame. Downstairs, Julian was a whirlwind of activity. His voice echoed in the marble foyer, confident and commanding as he took calls, barked orders, and hosted meetings with men in dark suits. She would listen at her door, the sound of his success a constant, grating reminder of his betrayal. He was dismantling her father's legacy piece by piece, remaking it in his own image. He spoke of new ventures, of aggressive expansion. He was spending money he thought was his. Meanwhile, in the quiet of her room, Ellie was becoming a student of her father's empire. With Thomas as her guide, she learned to navigate the ledger. She spent hours, late into the night, the laptop's glow, the only light, tracing the flow of money. She saw how her father had structured everything. A handful of public-facing corporations were the visible tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface lay a sprawling, invisible network of shell companies and offshore accounts, a complex vascular system that fed the entire organization. Julian is planning to acquire a shipping competitor, she told Thomas one night, her voice low. She had overheard Julian celebrating the deal on the phone just an hour earlier. He called it the final piece of the puzzle for his Atlantic distribution. I see it, Thomas replied instantly. He has requested a transfer of $30 million from the Argus Holdings account to finalize the purchase. The request is scheduled for 2 days from now. Ellie looked at the screen, at the intricate chart Thomas had helped her build. Argus Holdings, it was one of the main arteries, a primary account used to fund major operational expenses and acquisitions. It was a bold move for Julian, a declaration of his new reign, and it was her first real opportunity. Can I move the money out of Argus before he does, she asked. You can move any funds you wish, mademoiselle. The question is one of strategy. Draining a primary account like Argus would be like severing a limb. He would notice immediately. The system would collapse. I don't want it to collapse yet, Ellie said, a cold certainty in her voice. I want it to fail when he needs it most. I want him to feel it break in his hands. Thomas was silent for a moment. A more subtle approach, then, he said. A test. There is a secondary account, a logistical fund named Northlight Properties. It currently holds $12 million. It is used for operational setup, a fund he will draw on after the acquisition is complete. Its absence would not be noticed for several days, perhaps a week. It would appear as a bureaucratic delay. A test. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating. It was one thing to study the ledger, to understand the power she held. It was another thing entirely to use it. The plan was simple. They would create a new identity for her, a ghost, a woman with a plausible backstory, a clean record, and a new Swiss bank account. Her name would be Sarah Price, a fictitious art consultant living in London. Thomas and his team worked with breathtaking efficiency. Within 24 hours, Sarah Price existed, complete with a digital footprint and the credentials needed to open a high-value private account. The night of the transfer, Ellie could not sit still. She paced her room, the plush carpet doing nothing to soothe her nerves. Every creak of the old house sounded like Julian's footsteps approaching her door. She waited until 2 in the morning, when the house was finally, truly asleep. She sat at her small desk, the laptop open, the burner phone on speaker beside it. Are you ready, mademoiselle? Thomas's voice was a calm anchor in her sea of anxiety. Yes, she breathed. He guided her through the sequence. It was a complex series of steps, a digital ballet of codes and confirmations. She moved $10 million from Northlight Properties into a temporary holding account. Then, from that account, she initiated the transfer to the new account belonging to Sarah Price. Her hands were slick with sweat. Her finger hovered over the final confirmation button. All the humiliations flooded back in a hot, sickening wave. Julian's smirk at their anniversary party, his voice in the study, laughing about her father's death, the way he looked at her, as if she were a piece of inconvenient furniture. The word echoed in her mind, sharp as broken glass. Camouflage. She pressed the button. A small window popped up on the screen. Processing transfer. The seconds stretched into an eternity. She held her breath, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen. She imagined alarms blaring in some server room, red lights flashing, men scrambling to their feet. She pictured Julian's phone ringing, waking him from his triumphant sleep. Then the bar was full. The window changed. Transfer complete. She stared at the words. $10 million had just crossed the globe. disappearing from one reality and reappearing in another, a reality only she controlled. "It is done, mademoiselle," Thomas said softly. "The funds are secure in the new account." Ellie slowly leaned back in her chair, the tension draining out of her, leaving an empty, buzzing calm. She listened. The house remained silent. No shouts, no alarms, no sound at all except for the faint whisper of the wind outside her window. She had committed an act of immense financial warfare from her bedroom, and no one in the world knew. Not yet. She looked at her reflection in the dark screen of the laptop. The face staring back was pale and tired, but the eyes were different. They were not the eyes of the fragile, decorative wife. They were the eyes of her father's daughter. The first domino had fallen, and Julian would never even hear it. The air in her bedroom was thick with the scent of waiting. It was a heavy, stagnant quiet, different from the silence of grief that had filled the house for days. This was the silence of a held breath, of a plan in its final fragile moments before execution. The laptop on her desk was closed, its smooth dark surface reflecting the dim lamplight like a pool of black water. Beside it, the burner phone lay dormant. She had done it. The first transfer was a ghost, a whisper of digits that had moved millions across the globe without a single alarm bell ringing. It was a test of the system her father had built, a system now at her command. Ellie sat on the edge of her bed, her hands folded in her lap, feeling the phantom vibration of that immense power. It was a low hum beneath her skin, a terrifying and exhilarating current she had never known. She had spent hours studying the ledger, not just the account numbers, but the notes her father had left. Decades of secrets, of leverage, of every handshake and every threat that had built the Vance empire. She saw the arteries and the veins of the entire operation, and she saw exactly where to place the needle. She had chosen a mid-level international shipping deal, one of Julian's first big solo projects as the new head. It was ambitious, designed to impress the old guard, and it required a huge immediate outlay of liquid capital to secure the port contracts. That capital was now sitting in a newly created, anonymous account in Zurich, an account that belonged to a woman who did not exist. The first sign of the storm was the sound of his footsteps. They were not the confident, measured strides of the master of the house. They were heavy, frantic, pounding up the grand staircase. She heard his voice, a low, furious growl from the hallway, barking at some unfortunate subordinate on the phone. The words were indistinct, but the rage was crystal clear. Ellie closed her eyes for a second, drawing in a slow, steadying breath. The actress was taking the stage. She arranged her face into a mask of weary sadness, letting her shoulders slump. She pictured her father's funeral, the cold rain on the black umbrellas, the hollow sound of dirt hitting the coffin. She summoned the real grief, the genuine ache of her loss, and let it wash over her. It was a useful tool now, a costume she could wear. The bedroom door flew open with a loud bang, striking the wall. Julian stood there, silhouetted against the brighter light of the hall. His tie was loose, his hair was a mess, and his face was flushed with a deep, ugly red. He looked like a man who had been running, a man who had collided with a wall he could not see. He ended his call with a vicious snap. He did not seem to notice her at first. His eyes scanned the room as if he was looking for an intruder, for someone to blame. Then his gaze finally settled on her, sitting on the bed. His expression curdled from simple fury into contempt. "Still here," he said. The words were not a question. They were an accusation. "Still sitting in the dark, feeling sorry for yourself." He strode into the room, leaving the door wide open. He smelled of sweat and his expensive cologne, a sour, agitated scent. "Do you have any idea what is happening? Do you even care?" Ellie flinched, a small, practiced movement. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and glistening. She made sure he could see the moisture in them. "Julian, what is it? What's wrong?" Her voice was a fragile whisper, the voice he expected to hear from her. He let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "What's wrong? I'm trying to close the single biggest logistics deal this family has seen in a decade, a deal that solidifies my position, that proves to every last one of your father's old dogs that I am in charge. And the money is gone." He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers digging into his scalp. "Not gone, just stuck. Frozen. Some impossible, idiotic liquidity problem that nobody can explain. The banks are giving me nonsense about compliance flags. Compliance. We are the compliance. He paced back and forth at the foot of her bed, a caged predator. This was supposed to be seamless, a simple wire transfer, but the funds are just inaccessible. It makes me look like a fool. It makes me look weak. He stopped and pointed a finger at her. And you're up here moping, wallowing in it. Your father is gone, Eleanor. When are you going to get that through your head and be useful for something? This was her cue. A single perfect tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. She let him see it. Her lower lip trembled. I'm sorry, she choked out, the words catching in her throat. I'm so sorry, Julian. I don't understand any of it. The business, the money. It was always Dad's world. I miss him so much. She let her voice break completely, burying her face in her hands. A sob tore through her, a raw, convincing sound of utter devastation. It came from a real place, from a memory of a time when she truly had felt this helpless. But now, behind the shield of her hands, her mind was a block of ice. She was watching him, judging his reactions, playing her part. Her performance had the desired effect. The anger in his face softened, replaced by a wave of profound irritation and disgust. He saw exactly what he expected to see. A fragile, useless, emotional woman who was a liability in a moment of crisis. She was not a partner. She was not even a person. She was a problem. Oh, for God's sake, stop it, he snapped, his voice losing its heat and taking on a cold, dismissive edge. Stop crying. It doesn't solve anything. What did I marry? A child? He sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation of a man burdened beyond endurance. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she felt the full force of his condescension. It was the same look he had given her in the library a lifetime ago, the look that said she was nothing more than camouflage. I'm sorry, she whispered again, peering at him through her fingers. Her face was a portrait of misery. Inside, she felt a grim sense of triumph. He was buying every second of it. He believed it all. Just pull yourself together, he said, his tone weary. He was already turning away, his mind back on his real problems. The frozen money, his damaged reputation. He had no more time or energy to waste on her. I have to go back downstairs. I have to fix this. I have calls to make, people to threaten. The last thing I need is you falling apart. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. He looked back at her one last time, a final flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Look, I know this is hard for you, he said, a pathetic attempt at sounding reasonable. But your mourning is becoming an inconvenience. Try to be a little less pathetic for me. He did not wait for an answer. He turned and walked out, pulling the door shut behind him with a firm final click. Silence descended on the room once more. Ellie remained perfectly still for a count of 10. She listened to his heavy footsteps retreating down the hall, their urgency returning. She heard his voice resume its angry barking as he descended the stairs. He was gone. He had seen the weeping widow. He had dismissed her. He had left her alone. Slowly, she lifted her head from her hands. Her face was still wet, but the sobs had vanished. Her eyes, which had been clouded with sorrow just a moment before, were now perfectly clear and cold as a winter sky. With a steady hand, she reached up and wiped the tear tracks from her cheeks with the back of her fingers. The movement was methodical, detached, like a painter cleaning a brush. The performance was over. The stage was empty. Her posture changed. Her slumped shoulders straightened. Her spine became a rod of steel. She rose from the bed, her movements fluid and silent. The fragile, grieving creature Julian had just berided was gone, evaporated as if she had never existed. In her place stood the true daughter of Marcus Vance, a woman who understood that the real power was not in the throne, but in the treasury. She walked across the plush carpet to the large walk-in closet. The dark wood door opened without a sound. Inside, past the rows of designer dresses and shoes she would never wear again, was a simple black carry-on bag. It was small, practical, and packed with ruthless efficiency. It contained a new passport under a new name, several credit cards tied to her Swiss accounts, a small bundle of cash in 3 different currencies, and a small encrypted hard drive. It held a complete copy of the ledger. Everything she needed, nothing she did not. She looked at the bomb, her expression unreadable. All the noise and fury from downstairs was just that, noise. The frantic death rattle of an empire that was already a ghost. Julian was fighting to save a kingdom whose foundations she had already turned to sand. She looked at her reflection in the full-length mirror on the back of the door. The elegant dress, the sad face, it was all a costume. Soon she would shed this skin for the last time. A wave of cold, clean certainty washed over her. There was no more fear, no more doubt, just the quiet hum of the engine she had set in motion. The final sequence was ready. Her escape was planned. The final transfers were queued. All that was left was to walk away. She looked at the packed carry-on bag again, hidden in the shadows of the closet. It was time. 2 hours after Julian left, the oppressive silence of the house finally felt like an opportunity. She had spent that time perfectly still, listening. She heard nothing. He was sleeping, convinced of her weakness, secure in his new kingdom. She pulled a single bag from the closet, packed only with essentials. A burner phone, new passports, and a laptop. The designer dresses, the jewelry, the photographs on the walls, were all props she was leaving behind. She walked barefoot across the plush carpet, a ghost haunting her own home one last time. At the top of the grand staircase, she paused. Moonlight cut across the marble floor where her father had taught her to walk. It was where she had stood in her wedding dress, a perfect bride for a perfect lie. Each memory was a chain, and every step she took down the stairs broke a link. The heavy oak door was the final obstacle. Arthur Finch's instructions had been clear. The security system had a blind spot, a 5-minute window beginning at exactly 2 in the morning. Her watch showed 2 minutes past. Her hand, steady and cold, turned the heavy brass handle. The lock disengaged with a soft, expensive click that sounded deafening in the stillness. She slipped outside, pulling the door closed until it latched behind her. She was free. A black sedan was parked in the shadows at the end of the long driveway. As she approached, a door opened silently. The driver took her bag without a word and placed it in the trunk. Ellie slid into the back seat. The car pulled away smoothly, gliding through the main gates, which stood inexplicably open. Arthur was a man of immense detail. She did not look back. In her mind, she saw Julian waking in the morning. He would go to his office, the one that had been her father's. He would try to move assets for a new acquisition. Then he would find the accounts frozen. He would find them empty. The drive to the private airfield felt both impossibly long and incredibly short. They arrived at a remote airstrip, marked only by a chain-link fence and a single hangar. A sleek white jet sat on the tarmac, its engines humming a low, powerful promise. The driver opened her door. "He wished you a safe journey," he said, his first and only words. It was all the confirmation she needed. She walked across the windy tarmac and climbed the short stairs into the cabin. "Just water, please," Ellie said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. It was steady, free of the trembling fragility Julian had always mistaken for her true nature. She buckled herself into a plush seat by the window. The plane accelerated with breathtaking force, pressing her back into her seat as the ground fell away. The lights of New York spread out beneath her like scattered diamonds, then shrank and disappeared. A flight attendant brought her water in a small, sealed box. "From Mr. Finch," the woman said softly. Inside the box was a matte black laptop. It felt less like a computer and more like a detonator. She opened it, its blue light illuminating her face. Following Arthur's instructions, she connected to the encrypted network. She took a deep breath and entered the long string of characters from her father's medallion. The screen flickered, and the ledger appeared. It was the complex heart of the Vance Empire laid bare. At the bottom of the screen was a single command prompt: Nightingale. Her father had warned her about preferring a mechanical bird to the real thing. Julian had the hollow structure. She was the real Nightingale, about to fly away and take the song with her. Her finger hovered over the trackpad. This was the point of no return. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of pure, focused rage. She pressed down. The click was almost silent. On the screen, dozens of progress bars appeared. Green lines extended from left to right as funds were pulled from New York, London, and Hong Kong. They flowed through a digital maze, pouring into a new account in Geneva. It was under a name that did not exist until 48 hours ago. She watched the silent demolition. Every completed bar was a support beam kicked away. By morning, Julian would be the king of a pile of dust. Hours passed. She did not sleep. She just watched the silent execution as the sun began to rise. A brilliant orange line on the horizon. The last progress bar finally completed its journey. A message appeared in simple green text. Complete. The system logged her out and the screen went black. It was done. A moment later, the intercom crackled. The pilot's voice was calm. "Good morning, Ms. Vance. We are beginning our initial descent into Geneva." Ms. Vance, the name hung in the air, foreign and yet deeply right. She slowly, deliberately closed the lid of the laptop. The quiet snap echoed in the cabin. It was the sound of a door locking forever. Sunlight cut across Julian Croft's penthouse, but he was already awake. His phone had not stopped vibrating for the past hour. He finally answered the sixth call. It was Thomas, his chief financial officer, his voice thin with a terror Julian had never heard. The man was babbling about liquidity, about access codes being rejected, about entire accounts being zeroed out. Julian told him to calm down and fix it, then ended the call. He walked to the window, looking down at the city he had won. A cold knot of unease settled in his stomach. The phone buzzed again, a name he did not want to see, a partner from a rival organization. Julian answered with forced confidence. The voice on the other end was not panicked like Thomas's. It was a low growl that promised violence. The man did not ask what was wrong. He simply stated a fact. His quarterly dividend, a sum of 8 figures, had not arrived. He then asked a simple question. Where was his money? Julian promised to look into it. The line went dead. This was not a glitch. This was an attack. He logged into his personal laptop into the main corporate portal that gave him a view of his entire financial structure. Access denied. He tried again. Access denied. He slammed his fist on the glass desk. He used his master override, a code known only to him. The screen flickered and a single stark message appeared. All administrative privileges revoked. The phone rang again. It was the general counsel from their primary lending bank. The woman's voice was formal and utterly devoid of warmth. She was informing him that due to a total loss of underlying assets, all of Vance Holdings' corporate credit lines were frozen. Effective immediately, hundreds of millions of dollars were gone. Julian dropped the phone. It clattered onto the floor. He stared at his reflection in the dark screen of his laptop. He saw a man in a $1,000 pajamas set in a $50 million apartment who was, in that exact moment, worth nothing. The empire had been hollowed out. Then a thought surfaced, quiet and absurd. Ellie, his wife, the woman he had called camouflage. He remembered her father, Marcus, and his words whispered years ago. The throne is not the power, the real power is the treasury. The absurdity made him laugh, a short, ugly sound. Fragile, decorative Eleanor? The idea was insane, but the thought would not leave. Who else knew the deep structure of the family's finances? Who else had a motive that was not just business, but personal? He had taken everything from her, her father, her home, her dignity. He remembered her face the last time he saw her, the tears he had provoked so easily. He had felt disgust and triumph. He had broken her, but now, replaying the memory, he saw something else behind the tears. It was not the look of a victim. It was the placid, unreadable calm of a mask. The realization hit him with physical force. He staggered back. He had been played. Thousands of miles away, Eleanor Vance sat at a small table at a lakeside cafe in Geneva. A delicate cup of espresso sat before her. On her slim phone, she scrolled through a global news feed, and there it was. The first alert had come just minutes ago. A major New York holding company, Vance Holdings, was in a state of freefall. The headline was stark. Vance Empire in sudden collapse. She tapped the link. The article was speculative, confused. Analysts were baffled. No one could understand how a century-old dynasty could evaporate in a single business day. Ellie read the words without a change in her expression. She had seen these words in her mind for weeks. She had planned for them and executed the plan that made them real. She took a slow sip of her espresso. The bitter, complex flavor was a shock to her senses. It was real. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a slow path down her cheek. It was for her father, the cold man who had loved her enough to give her the ultimate weapon, his trust. It was for the fragile ghost she used to be, and it was a tear of pure, unadulterated release. Julian had been right about one thing. She was a perfect camouflage. But she had not been hiding weakness. She had been hiding her father's legacy in a mind that saw every detail. Her father taught her that true power is not loud. It is silent. It is absolute. The immense fortune now sat in anonymous, untraceable accounts, giving her more power than Julian had ever possessed. He had only borrowed the throne. She owned the kingdom. She placed her phone face down on the table. The frantic news from a world away was his chaos now, not hers. She finished her espresso, the last drop of final, satisfying punctuation mark on her old life. She paid her bill with a few crisp Swiss francs and stood up. The sun was higher now, casting a brilliant light across the promenade. Eleanor took a deep breath of the free air and began to walk. She walked into the bright morning, a free woman with an empire in her pocket.